again. So glad you're joining us this morning, and just here's the proverbial out of my back pocket gold star for making it on New Year's Day. I don't know how many people stayed up. I haven't seen the ball drop live in a few years. I'm just when I wake up, it'll just get here quicker. So it's kind of like my following ongoing resolution to never skip out on sleep. I really want to be there for sleep. There's a couple of exceptions. One is the Royal Rumble every year. I got to stay up for that. But secondly, it's at the Bengals playing prime time. And I got to be honest, usually I'm pretty disappointed that I stayed up to watch that.
But not tomorrow.
Not tomorrow. So
usually I spend the whole next day wishing I just went to bed earlier
after staying up for that stuff.
But kudos to you.
Thank you so much for being here. We are so glad you are joining us today here on January 1st. And I don't know if you're the kind of person that makes resolutions or sets new goals in the new year. I am definitely not the kind of person that does that. I just set myself up for failure. But thinking over my life and in my persistence in learning more about what it means to follow Jesus, I've been thinking about just how in 2023 I can take more steps in the right direction. And one of those realizations I have is it's not really to do more or to do better or anything. It's just to remember who God is. I just want to go into 2023 remembering who God is, especially in those moments where life takes major turns and shifts in a great way. So this morning we're kind of considering this I guess a bridge sermon, if you will, that will connect into a new series that starts next week. And we're going to talk more about that as we go on today. So if you have your Bibles, if you want to turn with me to Psalm 90. Psalm 90. One of my handy things is that if you open the exact middle of the Bible, it's pretty much Psalms. It's going to be Psalms 90% of the time. So just go over to 90. We're going to be in through verses 1 through 6, but it's also going to be overhead if you want to follow along that way. And as we look that up, I want to introduce the idea that we're talking about today. And how I want to be more mindful heading into 2023. What should we be more mindful of on this day into the days ahead? And that's simply this. Amid the change that happens in our lives, amid the change that will happen in our lives, God is still working a perfect plan. Amid anything that happens that shifts our lives in one direction or the next, God in this moment right now is still working a perfect plan. And as we sit here this morning, and as many are tuning in from home, man, our 2022s looked extremely different from person to person, right? Our 2022s looked extremely different from family to family. For many of us, 2022 was a season of abundance. A lot of great things happened. A lot of good things came into our lives, and we had a lot of pleasant surprises. So 2022 was an up year. For a lot of us, 2022 was kind of like, it was another year. Kind of did what I wanted to do, achieved what I wanted to achieve, kind of ho-hum, ready for 2023 and what that brings. For many of us, 2022 was a season of loss, of drastic life-altering change. It was a year of unpleasant shifts in life, and that's me saying it to the very least. And throughout any of these categories that you might find yourself in, the truth today that we want to make abundantly clear is this: there is still a perfect God. There is still a perfect God who is working a perfect plan right now for His glory. And Christmas is always a perfect example of that, right? What does the Christmas story remind us about God? It reminds us that God has a plan. And it's a plan, from the very beginning. It's a plan that has not changed, and it's a plan that will not change. And in order to focus on that idea this morning, we're in Psalm 90. We are in Psalm 90. Now, if you look through the Psalms, you may notice, you may have realized that most of the Psalms are attributed to one author, right? Who, if anybody knows, just say David, right? David has written the majority of Psalms, but this specific Psalm, Psalm 90, it has a very famous, different, but famous author. You see, Psalm 90 was written by Moses. It was written by Moses. And the fact that Moses wrote this particular psalm makes it one of the oldest, if not the oldest, psalm out of them all. And the first section of this psalm is particularly interesting, especially when you hold it up and you compare it to the trajectory of Moses' life. So let's read together. Again, verses 1 through 6 of Psalm 90. A prayer of Moses, the man of God. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, you brought forth the whole world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn people back to dust, saying, Return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They're like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it's dry and withered. You see, Moses begins by calling God his dwelling place. He says, God, you are the place where I live. And then he talks about God having always been, even before the creation of the world. He says, everlasting to everlasting, that is who you are. You are God. He worships our God who exists outside of time, our God who has dominion and power and authority over all things. You see, Moses sees God as his constant throughout his life, which again is pretty telling considering all the major life shifts and events that occurred in his life. If you remember Moses' story, it begins in the book of Exodus. His life was full of drastic changes. It began as a baby when in Exodus 2, he was not even meant to live at all. You see, the Egyptian Pharaoh at the time of his birth, who was holding the Israelites in slavery in Egypt, he ordered all the Hebrew male newborns to be killed. Because the Israelites were growing so much in number, they were multiplying very quickly, and he wanted to squelch that. And when Moses was born, his mother decided to hide him in a basket along the Nile River in the reeds in order to save his life. And as he was down there, he was found by Pharaoh's daughter and eventually adopted into their family. So even at the very beginning of his life, not even 1 year old yet, Moses found himself removed from his maternal family and taken in by the royal family in Egypt. As a young man, Moses experienced another drastic life change in his life. Later in Exodus 2, Moses sees an Egyptian man who is beating one of the Hebrew slaves. And he decides to take matters into his own hands, and he goes and he kills the Egyptian. And after news of that spread all throughout Egypt, eventually Pharaoh tried to have Moses killed. So Moses has to run away from everything that he knows, and he runs to a place called Midian, running away from his home, running away from his life in Egypt, and having to spend this time starting over. And after coming to the aid of some Midian women who were being attacked, their father rewarded him by giving his daughter Zipporah to Moses as a wife. And they have a child named Gershon, and you can kind of get a glimpse of Moses' feelings at that time. He names him Gershon because the name means, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. You can see there's another drastic change, another drastic shift in Moses' life, his young life. Later, when that Pharaoh died, and the Israelites were crying out to God in the pain of their slavery, God remembers his promises to his people, and he decides he's going to raise someone up to bring his delivery and salvation to his people. And that person happened to be the imperfect the unstable Moses. The Lord appears to Moses in this burning bush and calls him, I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to free my people from slavery. And in this drastic change in Moses' life, he's given a promise by God. And I think it's this promise here that would serve to be the constant in his life. And I think it's this promise that would cause him to go on in his life to write what he did and what we just read in Psalm 90. You see, when Moses pushes back on God and says, man, who am I that you would send me to Pharaoh in order to do this great thing? What is God's response? Exodus 3, first part of verse 12. And God said, I will be with you. Be with you. I will be with you. My presence will be with you. With God's presence and his promise to him, Moses eventually goes, he leads the Israelites out of Egypt, and he even calls on God's power to split a mighty Red Sea, to lead the Israelites from slavery to freedom. So that's the story. Happily ever after, right? Not quite. You see, Moses would go on from that moment to wander in the wilderness with the people. He would experience life-altering changes by leading his people through the wilderness on their way to the land that God promised to them. He would stand in the presence of God to be given his commands for the people, only to come back down with those commands and experience the people worshiping idols and setting off a chain of events that he would have to continue standing between the Israelites and God's wrath. He would have to continue to try to plead not for God. Don't wipe the people away. They don't know what they're doing. He would have to consistently do this for many, many years. So that's kind of a Cliff Notes version. But if you read in its entirety all the events of Moses' life, it would be impossible to believe that Moses lived a life that was void of any major changes. It would be impossible to believe that Moses lived a smooth life that didn't have any major shifts or changes or life-altering experiences. So when Moses decides to compose a psalm in praise of God, if I had to guess anything he would write down, I would think, man, he's probably going to talk about all this change and shift in his life, right? He's going to talk about all the shifts that have happened and how complicated his life was all throughout following God, right? That's what he should have wrote about, I think, but he didn't. He didn't do that. Instead, he focused on the one constant that was given to him. Lord, you have been our dwelling place through all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting. You are God. He focuses on that. Through all the ways his life drastically changed, Moses remembers God. He remembers him as the constant throughout his entire life. He remembers God as our constant in our entire existence. He remembers the promise given to him back at that burning bush. I will be with you. I will be with you. And as we said, this past year may have come with unexpected changes, some good changes, some bad changes. And here, as we sit here on January 1st, just one step into the new year, I'm here to tell you that your lives are going to be filled with even more changes. Your lives are going to be filled with unexpected shifts that you saw out of nowhere. You're going to stand up to the plate ready to hit a home run, and someone's going to drop a slider just like that and confuse you. You're going to gain, and you're going to lose. Like Moses, we can find our dwelling place in our never-changing God. We can live in the presence of our God, our dwelling place who never changes, who is working a perfect plan. At that time, at this time, and in the days ahead, he is working a perfect plan. Let's live in it. Let's live in his presence. So there are two things that we can kind of guarantee right now. this morning, there's kind of two things we can guarantee through all this. The first, our God and his plan never changes. God is the same yesterday, He is the same today, and He will be the same tomorrow. And He has been, and He is true to His promises. And secondly, change is inevitable. Change is going to happen. You will experience life-altering changes throughout your life. I'm going to experience life-altering changes. It's inevitable. So how do we live in light of those guarantees? How do we live in light of those guarantees? How do we move forward reconciling the truths that God never changes, but we will? One of the places that I visited that was just very interesting, I haven't been down there in a long time, was Mammoth Cave. How many of you have been to Mammoth Cave? Yeah, it's kind of like a pilgrimage for a lot of us in the area that are able to get down there. But I love Mammoth Cave, and I remember a few things about the caves that I really liked. I remember the cathedral domes and just how marvelously spectacular they looked. And they had like a huge ceiling. It's almost like you weren't even in the cave when you were experiencing that. And I remember at one point, they took us into one section of the cave and they shut out all the lights for our tour group. I don't know if anybody had gone through that too, but they said, we just want to give you an idea of how dark it is. And they shut off all the lights and we were instantly enveloped in this really thick darkness, a darkness that I have never experienced before or since. And I thought, that's fascinating. But one of the facts of the caves that I loved the most was that the caves maintain a constant temperature. A constant temperature. No matter what time of the year you go to the caves, the temperature inside doesn't really move. It is constantly around 54 degrees inside the caves, which is really cool if you decide you're going to go once in the summer and then you're going to go again in the winter. Because when you go in the summer and you go into the caves, you kind of walk in and you're like, oh, it's so cool down here. It's like refreshing to be in the cold air. So you take your time on the tour, like you're just going to scoot your feet. Like I am not going back out in that heat, right? I think that's the time I went and I'm getting flashbacks. But in the winter, you go to the cave and it's kind of a respite from the cold. That 54 degrees compared to 10 or 20 degrees outside, it'll warm me up. You'll say, man, this feels just so comfortable in here. But the truth is, no matter what effect the temperature has on us at a certain time in a certain season, that temperature is going to remain the same. And that got me thinking about God's presence in our lives. Because no matter what circumstances and changes that we're going to face, no matter what circumstances brought us into the presence of God, it's His presence and His promises that will always remain. Now, it may affect us and act on us in different ways depending on the season of life that we're in. Just like the temperature may affect how we experience the caves. But our God, it does not change that our God is working a perfect plan that has not changed from the very beginning. Our God is still constant. Our God is still reliable. Our God is never shifting, and He is the same as He was yesterday. He is the same today. We can confidently look to our God, just as generations before us have, not as the great I was, not as the great one who has done things in the past, or the great has been, but each generation, including ours, can say, we worship and we live in the great I am. We can know that when God promises something, it's going to come to pass. And it will come to pass on His time and not ours. And it's going to come to pass on His term and not ours. So we have to have confidence in Paul's words from Romans. From Romans 8:28. All things for the good of those who love Him, who are called according to His purpose. Especially when things happen in our lives that cause us to question His plans. I can only imagine that Moses looked up a time or two through everything that happened in his life and questioned what God was doing amidst the change. And it frequently threw him into confusion and threw him for a loop. But what we need to remember this morning, amid change that happens in our lives, in times in our lives that just don't make sense, we need to remember this. Just because I don't understand what he's doing, it doesn't mean he's not working his plan right now. Just because I don't understand algebra doesn't mean it doesn't work. And trust me, I've tried for years. Just because I can't see an artist's perspective or focus in the middle of his work doesn't mean that the artist is not in the process of creating a masterpiece of art. Friends, when life comes with changes and it throws us curveballs or sharp curves that we need to navigate, we can stand here and we can have confidence that our God, who never changes, is working a perfect plan. And because God in his plan never changes, we are invited, starting right now, starting today, to run into 2023 fully expecting the unexpected, fully expecting the shift, fully expecting the change, knowing that God's will has been, continues to, and will be done. Let us look at our lives as it plays out. When something happens that is drastic or something happens even that is great, we can say, no matter what happens in our lives, God, you are my dwelling place. You are where I live. You are where I put my trust. Because we got to understand that change is an inevitable part of our lives. But our changes in our lives occur alongside the perfect plan of God that never changes. So, how do we handle life's changes in light of that truth? Like we said, we can live in the presence of God, but change is still inevitable. So how do we handle the changes? So we want to begin the new year, by talking about expecting the unexpected. So beginning next week, we'll kick off a series with different accounts in Scripture where we're just like Moses. We read of people who had to deal with very sudden changes that happen in their lives. People like going back to Mary and Joseph. People like John the Baptist. Even Jesus himself had to deal with major shifts in their lives. How did they handle it? How can we learn by their example to expect the unexpected? Because as we're going to focus on beginning next week, there is something deeper in that verse we shared earlier from Romans 8. When we decide to follow Jesus, we are submitting ourselves to be part of God's story. We're submitting ourselves to be part of God's never-changing plan. And we are asking him to use us for his glory, to bring his kingdom to the ends of the earth. That's what we ask him to do. We say, "Here I am, Lord, send me to join the mission of Jesus to reconcile the world back to God." And when we do that, our lives are not going to be comfortable. Our lives are certainly not going to be smooth. But I tell you, when we find our dwelling in God and his promises, it's going to be worth every bump in the road. It's going to be worth every change. It's going to be worth every shift that happens as we live our lives. Because when we align ourselves with God's perfect plan, that's when our lives are lived with purpose. That's when our lives are lived with meaning. And we can live with that purpose and we can live with that meaning amidst the sudden changes that might happen in our lives. And here we are on January 1st of a brand new year. What better time is there to maybe decide for that first time, I want to align myself with God's plan. I want to follow Jesus. Because when change happens in my life, I want to be comforted to know that there is a God who is still working for the good of those who love him, who are called according to this purpose. I love him. I want to accept him. How do I do that? We do that by being baptized. And as we're baptized, we receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. the power of God and the presence of God that lives within us as we live within him in order to make his glory known to the ends of the earth. And as we follow Jesus, we grow to become more and more like him in our actions and in our words. And we shine the light of the gospel message to everyone around us. And when change happens in our lives, because it's going to happen, we can be like Moses, who declares God to be his dwelling place, the place where he lives, his everlasting presence. So if you've had to make that decision to Jesus in baptism, make this morning that morning to be baptized in his name. And if you want to make that decision, we want to invite you to come forward as we sing this song. But however, I want you to also think about the fact, as you leave this place today, have you made Jesus your dwelling place? Have you made him the calm ship among the stormy seas? That when life change happens at a drastic level, because this year it's going to happen, have you made him your home, your place of confidence, and your place of comfort and rest? So think about that as well as we stand together. And let's just sing about the fact that our God loves us so much that he would send us Jesus to always be a reminder for us that our God never changes, that our God is working a plan, and that he will never change. Let's sing together.